Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming down and sharing some of your day with us. It's a gorgeous day outside, and we appreciate you coming in here out of that beautiful sunshine and sharing, and it's going to be very, very well worth your time. Welcome to Whalefest Monterey 2017. This is our 7th iteration of this cycle of Whalefest, and we're really, really pleased, and we're so happy that this sun is shining. Last year it was raining. You are in for a treat, and I'm going to get out of here real quick. Our next speaker, Tim Thomas, my notes say local fisheries historian. He is so much more than that. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Tim for my television show, and I have seen him at work. He is a veritable encyclopedia of knowledge. So for all those watching the video and for all of you here in the audience, buckle up because you're in for a great ride. Please, a warm Whalefest welcome for Tim Thomas.
So I hope I can live up to that. Yes, my name is Tim Thomas. I am a fisheries historian. I researched the human history of this bay for about 30 years. I was the historian and curator actually for this museum when it was the Maritime Museum for 16 years. And actually, I know this is the 7th version of Whalefest, but Whalefest actually goes back much further than that. There was another version of Whalefest that I was involved in 15 years ago or so we did a number of those. So I have to make a couple confessions before we get started here. I actually put this program together on Friday. I spent about 3 hours putting together this PowerPoint program, and I actually haven't looked at it since I put it together. So I hope I remember what comes up. And I actually have way too many things in this, so I tend to, we'll just keep going, and when they tell me to get off, I'll get off. As you see, I have a title, Abalone and Sake, when the Japanese ruled the Monterey Wharf. So I'll just get it up front here that the Japanese actually were the dominant community on that Monterey Wharf, really up to the beginning of World War II. The majority of the business on that wharf before World War II were Japanese-owned, almost about 80%. Fish markets and abalone processors. Now, I mentioned sake. Let's see if this works when it's supposed to. I'm not a very technical person. I don't even drive a car. Oh, here we go. That's the right button. So I'm not talking about this kind of sake, although this is a wonderful thing, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about this sake here, or salmon. So in Japanese, actually, sake also is the word for salmon. This is a king salmon, and it was actually salmon that put Monterey on the wharf, put Monterey on the map, and on the wharf. Japanese fishermen coming here in the 1890s, and they dominated that bay out there. And just to give you an idea of how large that salmon fishery really was, at the end of the 1909 salmon season, which lasted 3 months, May 15th to August 15th, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was a local newspaper at that time, reported at the end of that 1909 salmon season there were 185 salmon boats working in Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese-owned, catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. That is a lot of fish. So let's go to the beginning here. Let's start why all this happened. Well, this is a group of Japanese fishermen, or Japanese businessmen actually, over by around Adams Street in Monterey. And I'm not supposed to move my post here, but the gentleman, let's see, I'm going to move for 1 second. Pay attention, these two guys right here. So the gentleman in the mustache there, by the name of, is Otto Sabaru Noda, and the gentleman behind him is a guy named Junosuke Kidani. Noda actually immigrated to California in the 1890s, made his way to San Francisco, then worked his way south, working in Watsonville, eventually working at Spreckles Sugar, and then came to Monterey about 1896. Was working for the Pacific Improvement Company, which was then the land arm of the Southern Pacific. Actually, we were a separate company at that point. And they owned a lot of property here on the peninsula, and Noda was in the business of, was hired by them to collect wood and to supply food to other work camps along the peninsula here. And he also worked with a guy named Ide, who was his partner. Well, Noda was here on the wharf, near the Monterey Wharf around that time, looks down into the harbor, and he just sees all this abalone down there. In fact, so much abalone, he described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone, and nobody was doing anything with it. And the reason nobody was doing anything with it, because nobody knew what the heck you're supposed to do with it. Unless you're repairing abalone properly, it's kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese, been dealing with abalone for centuries, they knew what to do with it. So Noda saw and writes a letter back to the government of Japan and said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends a man standing behind him, Jinosuke Kidani, here he is a little later, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. Anybody here been to Japan? So Chiba Prefecture, you fly to Tokyo, you go to Narita Airport, that's in the Chiba Prefecture. These guys all come from an area known as the Boso, a big, beautiful peninsula about 2.5 hours southwest of Tokyo. The beautiful peninsula, a lot like the Monterey Peninsula, a series of little towns, Tateyama, Shikura, Shirohama, and they were abalone, still are to this day, abalone community. And Kidani was in the abalone business, and so they sent Kidani down here to check it out. Here he is, a little bit later. He says, man, this is great. He sends back to Japan for abalone divers known as ama, or free divers. In between that time, Noda or Kidani kind of worked his way around the peninsula, trying to find a place where he could develop his abalone business. Ends up out of Point Lobos, which at that point belonged to this gentleman here, this man named A.M. Allen, Alexander McMillan Allen, who actually was a pretty progressive thinker for his time. He was a businessman. He was a racetrack designer. Of course, he was a mason. But he really came to Monterey because he was a mining engineer. He came here to run a coal mine out of Point Lobos. And they're producing a pretty low-grade coal, so the company really wasn't making a lot of money. And so they began to parcel off the property out there, selling it for home lots. Allen thought there was something better we could do with that property, so he bought it from his partners, and went out and bought all the lots that were already sold, and he preserved it. And Kidani is about Point Lobos and leased a small piece of property, if you know Point Lobos, where the whaler's cabin is and that whaler's cove. He leases that piece of property and begins his abalone operations out there. And Allen watched him for about a year and said, there's money to be made here, and he became partners with Kidani. And when I mean they're partners, they were truly partners in every sense of the word there. In between that time, Noda goes down to Cannery Row, or what was then Ocean View Avenue, and leases this piece of property. Anybody know where this is? Nope, this is about the middle of Cannery Row, where they're going to build, at one time they're going to build, it's a big empty lot to this day, they're going to build what was a marketplace at one time down there. He leases this piece of property right here, and he also sends back to the Wakayama prefecture of Japan and sends for salmon fishermen. They come over and actually establish a Japanese fishing camp on this very site right here. These ama come over. Here's two ama, or free divers. They came over about 1897 or so, and I believe, came down to this site and dove off this beach. The first abalone divers diving off this beach right here in these thin cotton white outfits, pair of goggles. You can see the abalone basket right there. And they went into the Monterey Bay and jumped into the water. About 10 seconds later, jumped back out, and they said, Kidani-san, you didn't tell us how cold that water is. There's about a 15-degree water temperature between Monterey and Japan. That is a big difference. We also believe that Noda had sent for women divers. We have a report from a Japanese government report, actually from 1902, that talks about a company, it would have been Noda's company, I'm sure, that sent for the women divers that came and dove in ama style in Monterey Bay. They lasted for one season. But most of these guys were men. Diving ama style. We make fun of this ama thing, but the truth is there were ama divers in the Monterey Bay into the 1920s, and they worked in pairs. So they had on the boat they had a big barrel with fire, and were partners. And one diver would go into the water. He had a rope tied around his waist, and then the rope would run through a pulley system on the boat, and then he would follow the anchor line down into the bottom of the bay, 30, 40 feet sometimes, and he'd stay down there for 2 minutes. So I define anybody here to hold their breath for 2 minutes. And then when he's ready to come up, his partner would take the other end of that rope, which was in that pulley system, which had a rock tied around it, and he'd toss it over the boat, that then pull that diver strap to the surface, and he would then warm himself up with a fire as his partner went down into the water and repeated the same process. So Noda, besides bringing these ama and bringing these salmon fishermen, built a cannery on that very site in 1902, and the very first sardine cannery on Cannery Row was a Japanese-owned cannery, Monterey Fishing and Canning Company. This is a label from his cannery. The cannery only operated between 1902 and 1907. He worked with a partner, a guy named Harry Malpas, who actually was the manager of the Point Lobos cannery, and then he came over to work. He and Noda opened this cannery. Noda left the cannery in 1907, mainly to work on better treatment of the Japanese in California, especially school children. He actually traveled to Washington, D.C. and spoke to Teddy Roosevelt on the Japanese behalf. He eventually worked back to California and ended up in Northern California, up in the Maine where they're growing rice, and he became a rice farmer and actually developed a special breed of rice. It was actually a cross between rice from Texas and rice from Japan. And they used to call it Noda's rice. But he was the very first cannery on Cannery Row. It was a Japanese-owned cannery, and which most people don't know. And those are actual facts. Those are not my alternative facts. But as I mentioned, these guys, ama, they were not making, the water was a bit cold, so they began, and at the same time the Japanese trained with the helmet divers. They sent for helmet divers, and again, the helmet dive for abalone in Monterey Bay, but even for these guys, that water was too cold. So these guys all became knitters. They take wool sweaters and tear apart, they knit this wool underwear, put on a pair of that, sometimes 2 pairs of that, put on their clothes, put on a big heavy canvas suit, attach about 65 pounds of lead weights to their front and back. They would tie lead to their shoes, bolt on the helmet, which had a hose attached to it. They go down into the Monterey Bay. Now, you can see on this photograph, you can see in this photograph, Kadani's actually a guy in the suspenders in the middle of the boat right there. You can see the diver here on the ladder down there, and there's actually and they would actually hand pump the air down to the diver, and he would go down 15, 20, maybe 30 feet into the Monterey Bay. The deeper he went, the harder it was to pump. Here's a photograph. This is at Point Lobos. You can see the 2 abalone dive boats, and these are actually converted whaling boats that were there when these Japanese guys first arrived here, and they converted them to these dive boats, and you can see the pump in the boat right there. And then these guys would guide, and they would actually go all over, not just stay at Point Lobos, they're going all over the Monterey Peninsula. This is actually a wonderful, wonderful photograph of those 2 boats there. This is one of those divers. This is a guy named Takanashi, and you can see this is obviously a portrait. I took this picture actually in Japan, in a town called Shirahama, and all the families, many of the families. In fact, the first time I ever went there, I was given a tour of this little town, and sort of my caterpillar was pointing out all the houses. He says, diver house, diver house, diver house. All these houses that divers lived in came to Monterey over 100 years ago. Well, for the most part, their families still lived there, so we went to visit them, and one of the first things that we see are these portraits of their relatives that come to Monterey. And you can see, if you can see on the bottom, it says F.L. Swain Portraits, Monterey, California. So they all got dressed up when they get their picture taken. Here's another guy named Kurohawa. Now, his story is kind of interesting because he was not a diver in Japan. He was not in the abalone business. He was a rice farmer. But it was a small town. He knew all these guys. And he said, man, I want to do that. You know, it was kind of adventurous, going off to a foreign country and everything. And so they signed him up and put him on a ship. He sails across the Pacific, took about 2 weeks in, comes into San Francisco in December of 1907, gets on the train, the Oman Express, comes down to Monterey, goes out to Point Lobos. Within a day of arriving, with no experience whatsoever, he's diving abalone. He hated it. But he loved living here. Spent about 20 years here. He could read and write, which was really unusual at that time. So he read letters for the divers, he wrote letters for the divers, he became a bookkeeper for the divers. And he actually started diving abalone. He didn't dive, he used to collect abalone using viewing boxes, a big pry. They'd pry them off the rocks there. He called Chinese style. So here's a photograph that I recently found. This is again, you can see the pump from the boat, and there's Kurohao and Takanashi right sitting next to each other there on this very picture. This was very early, about before 1910. And you can see Kidani also is standing right next to Mr. Takanashi there. So they were initially drying all this abalone and shipping it back to Japan, shipping it to China, shipping it to Hawaii and Australia, where there was a large Japanese Chinese community that lived there that were buying it. And they also began to can it, and they were canning it like they were canning sardines. Or at that time, they were just steaming it in the cans. They'd cut it up, put it in the cans, they'd steam it up, and then they were selling this. So the dried abalone actually was going obviously overseas. The canned product they were trying to sell to the domestic market mainly was a tough sell, no pun intended there, but they were buying it for salads and different kinds of making soups out of it. You can see recipes on the label. These are from the chef of the Hotel Del Monte who produced those particular recipes to try to promote this market. But there's another player in the story here. And it's this guy right here. This is a German restaurateur by the name of Pop Ernst Dulter. Pop Dulter moved to Monterey with his family in 1907, opened a small restaurant on Alvarado Street called Cafe Ernest. It was sort of a European-style, Bohemian-style restaurant that catered mainly to the Bohemian crowd. That's what he was after anyway. People go and spend the whole night in the restaurant. And it mainly focused on oysters. That was a big thing in those days. And he never could get fresh oysters. He always had a hard time coming down from San Francisco by train. Oftentimes that train would get stalled. The train would stop, and of course, they couldn't keep it fresh. It was a big issue for him. And he was fast with his abalone thing. Couldn't figure out why nobody was eating it. So he brings it into his restaurant. You can see here's Pop standing in front of his restaurant here. This is on Alvarado Street. In fact, there's an ice cream store there today where his restaurant was. Here's the inside of that restaurant. He brought it into this restaurant, experimented with that abalone, and finally came up with this famous recipe. You shuck the abalone out of the shell, slice the foot, because that's your eating abalone is the foot. Pound it to make it nice and soft. Then he ran through egg wash, cracker crumbs, olive oil, cooked it up quickly in olive oil. Soon people came from all over to eat fresh abalone steaks in Pop's restaurant. They sing songs and write poetry. Like some folks boast the quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. You can see George Sterling wrote that in his guest books in 1913. Also in 1913, the state of California made it illegal to export dried abalone out of the state. I mean, that was their business. They could export the canned product, but they could not export the dried product. And really, it was the dried product that people in Japan really were after. They didn't like the canned product so much. And abalone in Japan is a pretty special thing. It's actually the dried abalone in particular. You can today in Japan, you can buy, you get wedding cards. Oftentimes, dried abalone is glued onto pieces of it, are stripped and then glued onto or part of the wedding card. It's considered to be a good luck symbol. So the canned product was not all that welcome, and so they weren't making a lot of money. Here's another one of the divers, a guy named Watanabe, and you can see him in his dive suit and the helmet, and of course he's also in his overalls there. He's not in his wool underwear in that particular photograph. So where all these divers come from, as I mentioned, they come from Japan, come from an area known as Tateyama or Shirahama. Here is a photograph of one of the neighborhoods in Shirahama where these divers all come from. These houses you see here actually are houses of divers that did come to Monterey and dove here. Here's another house. This is actually the house of Kurohao. I showed you a picture of him. This is his family's house. It's in the town of Shirahama. It's right at the bottom of a little hill there. And as I mentioned, when we go to these houses, we saw those portraits, but also the first thing we saw in every single house has this shrine to Monterey. We had no idea these existed until then. That's how important this industry was to these families. So, as you all know, abalone is just a big marine snail. Like any snail eats plants, abalone eats kelp. In the late 19th century, off the coast of Cuba, there was a disease killing off all the brown kelp. So there was no abalone for you guys to die for. They weren't making any money. They couldn't feed their families. This opportunity opened up to come here to Monterey, dive abalone, sending that money home that kept their families alive, that they honor to this day. Look at these abalone shells here. These are world record size. I measured these things. You could take a bath in that shell. That's how big it is. That came out of that bay over 100 years ago. That doll you see there was purchased at Holman's department store in Pacific Grove in 1927, now a family heirloom. Another part of this whole thing is this. This is called a maiwai, and these are indigenous to that area of Japan in the Chiba prefecture. These are a special kind of ceremonial jackets that were given to the fishermen. That's what they would get at the end of the fishing season. They would get these, you get the painted piece of fabric, and then they would convert it into these special jackets that they would wear at special events and in ceremonies and things like that. But if you look at this one closely, of course, you see the American flag and the Japanese flag. Then down there below it says E-Day and Company, Monterey, USA. That was from here. We had no idea these had these jackets. We think there was less than 10 of these that were ever actually made. Now the museum, there's a museum in town called in Tateyama that I've worked with, and they actually have hundreds of these kinds of jackets in their collection that represents various different fisheries, whaling and sardine and different kinds of things. And they have one of these, and it was in beautiful condition. And we think less than 10 were made. And this comes from a family of the Kurohawa family. So and as far as we know, there are only 2 of these exist today. This one and one that's on a permanent exhibit in Tateyama. You today can go to the Japanese American Sicily Hall on Adams Street and see this jacket on exhibit in our little museum down there. So we're sort of bridging the 2 communities once again. In fact, the Kurohawas gave us this jacket, and Mrs. Kurohawa was her grandfather, who was one of the very first divers to come here before the turn of the 20th century. And she was very embarrassed because it wasn't in very good condition. You can see it's faded, it's kind of torn, and it was kind of dirty. But then she told us that after World War II, like many Japanese families, they were destitute, and this is the only thing they had to wear. So we took this and we worked with a maiwai maker in Chikura, who was actually the last of the traditional maiwai makers in Japan. And we had him make us another one, and here it is. This is a brand new one, but he replicated that jacket, and his whole family worked on this. It took them 2 years to make this jacket, and we now have it also at the JACL, and you can come see it there. His son, this maiwai maker's, his son, who was, this is about 5 years ago, he was a business student in Tokyo, and he was in Monterey, and he came to visit us at JCL, and I took him down to our little museum, and I actually, in that museum, I had a big, what they call a big catch flag, and it was also a good luck flag that you fly in your boat when you launched your new boat, which I actually collected in Japan. And he took some pictures around the museum, took a picture of that flag, he brought it back to home, and he showed it to his father. His father says, "Your grandfather made that flag. We didn't know that." And so he was so impressed by that he gave up his studies as a business student, and he went to work with his father, learn how to become a maiwai maker, which he does today, and he helped make this particular jacket. So 1874, let's see if railroad came, and in fact, let me see if I can do this. I have this in my pocket. So I don't know if you can all see this, but this key right here, this very key right here, changed the history of Monterey forever. This is the switch lock key from the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is the key that opened the lock, that pushed the track, that brought the train to Monterey, right there. Now you got a railroad. Now you go get fresh fish to big markets like San Francisco. That original railroad was the Monterey Valley Railroad. They built that road so they could ship fish to San Francisco, ship vegetables to Salinas Valley, and attract tourism to the Monterey area. But they were not financially very successful. They were bought out in 1880 by the Southern Pacific. The Southern Pacific bought that little railroad out. They also bought about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula. They had this kind of funny, quirky idea they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who thinks such a thing, right? So all these tourists coming to Monterey, got a place for them to stay. So he built this beautiful hotel here called the Hotel Del Monte. Of course, you know Monterey, this is where Naval Postgraduate School is today. They actually built this hotel in 3 months. It opened in June of 1880. And what this hotel really was, what they called a summer and winter hotel. Marked hotel to the rich folks that lived in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. Hey, got those cold winters, come to Monterey, spend a couple of months at the Hotel Del Monte. A lot of folks would do that. Now, these folks come to stay in your hotel, well, you got stuff for them to do. So they created that 17-mile drive, and they had, which by the way was never 17 miles, and they had golf, and they had polo, and eventually had art galleries and polo, and they had sport fishing out on the Monterey Bay. And they worked with the local fishermen at that time, and the local fishermen would take them out in the bay and show them the good place to fish for salmon in the bay. Well, in those early days, they were fishing salmon with gill nets, which was not the most effective way to catch salmon on that bay out there. And it worked with this gentleman here, a guy named J. Parker Whitney. Now, Mr. Whitney was a sport fisherman. He was a pretty wealthy guy. He and his brothers came to California during the California gold rush, but made a lot of money selling supplies to those gold miners. They also raised a special breed of sheep. So by the time he's about 30, he was a very, very wealthy man. He just spent the rest of his life traveling the world doing the things that he loved, which was hunting and fishing. He spent a lot of time here in Monterey, staying at the Hotel Del Monte, fishing salmon out in that bay out there. Here is a mailer that Hotel Del Monte would send out to entice these sportsmen to come back to the hotel. You can see there's our fisherman at the bow of the boat. You can see our sport fisherman there. He's dressed in a suit. That's actually probably Mr. Whitney right there. Here's the backside of that same mailer. Look, come back to the hotel. Look at all the great things that we caught today. Salmon, sea trout, sea bass, tuna, yellowtail, barracuda. Those are mostly warm water fishes that are not normally found in that bay out there, which tells me there was El Nino going at that time, which really changes things. But you see also down here this drawing of a salmon rig that revolutionized the fishing industry in Monterey, designed by our friend Mr. Whitney here. And it enabled them. Whitney also not only introduced this, but he also introduced the idea of fishing salmon that bay with a rod and reel, and fishing salmon that bay with a trolling line, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in that Monterey Bay. And our commercial fishermen said, well, wait a minute. We can do that. And I have salmon landing records to go back to that time, and you can see it. 1893, they caught maybe 5,000 pounds worth of salmon. Then they switched to new trolling technology. 1895, they caught over 95,000 pounds worth of salmon in that bay out there. Here's a wonderful picture of some sport fishermen on the wharf with their king salmon. That's a beautiful picture right there. But that's also Japanese fishermen. That this same salmon that Noda began to utilize, bringing in these Japanese fishermen. This is Japanese fishermen. This is the Monaka family actually on their boat, the Ohio #1. Out on the, you can see the boat here at the wharf behind in the background. There is the Hotel Del Monte wharf. You can see their bathhouse or swimming pool behind it right there. Here is all Japanese salmon boats. This is 1909, that season I mentioned where they caught over 1 million pounds worth of king salmon. They actually caught 1,500,000 pounds of salmon in 1909 salmon season. It was a huge deal. And you can see these guys all back here. These are all salmon boats. Here he's unloading at the wharf. See the salmon going up onto the Monterey Wharf. Again, these are all Japanese fishermen. But that 1909 salmon season was such a great season. At the end of that season, they had a wonderful sort of fiesta, a festival, a salmon festival on the wharf here. You can see the boat in front has musicians and all parading around the Monterey Wharf. They had fireworks and all kinds of things. It was a real big deal. So what were they doing all that salmon? Well, here's on the wharf. They're boxing it up right there. They weren't preparing it here in Monterey. They're putting it in crates like this. Crates were packed in ice, and then they were taking them by horse and buggy over to the train station. They're going to load them up on the train, and they're shipping up to San Francisco and to Pittsburgh, where they're then not canned, but they're kind of pickled. And they were sending them to Europe. About 90% of the stuff was going to Germany. That's where it was going. Very little of it actually stayed here in the United States. The big money actually was in Europe for that. And then in 1915, California welcomes the world to San Francisco. A World's Fair called the Panama Pacific International Exposition opens in San Francisco. It's a big World's Fair that's on the opening of the Panama Canal. If you've all been to San Francisco, the Palace of Fine Arts was built for this World's Fair. In fact, that whole area was just a big mud flat. It was all filled in for this World's Fair, about 650 acres or so of it. Every state was represented. They all had state buildings. The state of California had the largest of the state buildings. It was 5 acres in size. Every county was represented at the state building. Monterey had the largest of those exhibits, or one of the largest. Here is a photograph of the Monterey exhibit at that state fair. And you can notice it's all about abalone. Look at all that abalone in the picture. You can even have a diver in the case at that World's Fair. That's how important it was. Because again, here's the back of it. You can again see all the abalone shells and the big sea stars. Anybody remember the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History and had that wonderful exhibit of all those sort of stuffed fish? It's those fish that came from the World's Fair when at Pacific Grove Museum. In 1913, as I mentioned, the state of California made it illegal to export dried abalone out of the state. Also in 1913, our friend Popper and Stolter was offered a job at a restaurant called the Hofbrau in San Francisco to bring his abalone recipes up there. And they offered him so much money that he couldn't turn them down. And he closed his restaurant in Monterey, packed up his family, packed up his abalone recipes, and he moved moved to San Francisco and went to work at the Hofbrau selling abalone steaks. But no pun intended, at that time, abalone was a tough sell. Here is a photograph of the Point Lobos cannery booth at the Panama Pacific, and they're giving away canned abalone as a souvenir, and they're also sending folks down to the Hofbrau for abalone dinners. And here is the menu from the Hofbrau restaurant from that time period, and you can see down below, glued on the paper, is abalone specials. And here's a close-up abalone cocktail, that's 25 cents, abalone salad, abalone nectar, which is just the juice that came out of the shell, that's all it was. And you could get hot or cold. Of course, filet of abalone a la Ernest, that was Pop Ernest abalone. And he was doing, and through the whole world wanted this product. Hotels, restaurants, all wanted this new product, abalone. Pop actually leaves the Hofbrau the next year and opens a restaurant up on Bush Street called it Pop Ernest. It was a businessman's lunch restaurant that focused on abalone. But again, he had the same issue because all this abalone was going to the Hofbrau or going to the restaurant. His other restaurant in San Francisco was all coming from here, coming from Monterey, going by train. It would come every day, but oftentimes these trains would get delayed. Abalone doesn't stay fresh very long once it's out of the shell, and so oftentimes it would come spoiled. So it was always an issue for him when that happened. Also at this World's Fair, I should point out that, what's the problem here? Here we go. Not only were abalone introduced to that World's Fair, but also sardines were introduced to that World's Fair. So, as I mentioned, all that salmon was going to Europe, about 90% of it. All the sardines eating in this country then, coming from Europe, coming primarily from France. France was a big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. Well, what happens in the world in 1914? World War I cuts off all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines come from Europe, and they just switch, begin to heavily fish sardine along the west coast here. And I have to point out that the Monterey sardine, by the way, was never, ever a popular fish to eat. People just thought it was too oily. People liked those sardines that came from Europe. They liked those sardines that came from the North Atlantic, those little guys. But for those few warriors, the Monterey sardine was very popular. This is a business card that I actually found on eBay for the Booth Sardine Cannery. And when I bought this, I saw it on eBay. I couldn't read what it said. I said, oh, someone wrote on it. I was disappointed about that. And then when I got the card, I could see it says near U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. So that was from the Panama Pacific, a business card that booths were giving out to businessmen all over the United States to promote the Monterey sardine. Cool thing. So Pop says there's money to be made here. In 1917, he comes back to Monterey. He actually moves out to Point Lobos. He works with A.M. Allen and Konosuke Kidani to promote abalone and to sell it, fresh abalone steaks, to restaurants all along California. Develops a process to pack it, to keep it fresh. Also, anybody in Point Lobos, you go to the whaler's cabin. He created a sort of a factory in that whaler's cabin where they were pounding abalone and then cutting it, pounding it, and packing it. And then in 1919, he broke away from the Point Lobos, comes down to the Monterey Wharf and opens the very first restaurant on that Monterey Wharf called the Club initially, because it's the old Monterey Yacht Club, and then notice abalone and mussel specialties. Then quickly changed the name to Pop Ernest. Here is the early photograph of the restaurant. You can see Pop there and one of his sons. And this is, the building's no longer there, but this is right at the foot of the Monterey Wharf before you entered the wharf right there. He was famous for his abalone steaks and abalone stews and abalone salad. Also famous for this. This is a wonderful menu that he actually commissioned in 1930. Two very, very famous Monterey artists did this for free abalone dinners. The middle section was done by a guy named Joe Mora. Then the outer section was done by a guy named Armin Hansen. So here is an abalone diver. This is actually a drawing done by a guy named Ray Troll. And it's, if you know Pacific Grove, the NOAA building that's down by the lighthouse, there's a big mural painted around the building, and this is one of the panels of the mural. I worked with Ray a little bit when he came here to do that with the historical part of it. So this is a wonderful drawing of a Japanese diver. But if you look closely, I want you to take a look at the face behind the mask there, because there he is. That's my friend Roy Hattori, and there he is when he was about 90, and that picture there, this is when he was about 18 in his wool underwear, Roy is the only diver, Japanese diver, that was born here. So he was Nisei. All the divers came from Japan, with just a couple exceptions returned to Japan. But Roy's born here, just a couple hundred yards from the Monterey Aquarium. So that's how I learned how to do this. He told me that when he was a young man, he had just graduated from Monterey High School. His father was in the abalone business. During the Depression, he had a lot of debts to pay. He thought this would be a good way to make some money. They had no experience in this business whatsoever. They had friends who were in it. So he borrows some equipment, takes Roy a little boat in the middle of the Monterey Harbor, dresses him up in this wool underwear. In fact, Roy's mother knitted this underwear, puts on his clothes, puts on the big heavy canvas suit, attaches up to 65 pounds of lead weights to his front and back. He ties lead to his shoes. He bolts on the helmet. Then he just tossed him off the side of the boat. He said, "You start running down there." That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Luckily, the older diver turned on the wing and showed him what to do. So here's Roy, again, getting dressed in the suit. That's his brother and cousin there helping to do that. And then, again, you can see all the gear that they were using right there. And then there's, again, Roy getting ready to go into the water. And then here's going down that ladder into the water here. And, oh, that's the same. And then here he is. Wonderful picture. I love this photograph. You can see the boat in the water. You can see the crewmen on the boat, and a guy on the bow there with the skull, which they use, which is technology came from Japan, and they just use that skull to go over, they would just track the bubbles. That's how they kept the boat over the diver. If they had a motor, then oftentimes they could cut that hose, right? So they just use that skull. So if you notice the wooden covering over the motor, you can see that there's Roy's shoes are on there. That's why he kept his shoes on the motor. He said, so when he got out of the water, he could put them on because their shoes would be warm. And of course, there's a tea kettle there also. Here is a very, very rare photograph of actually a working boat. This was taken off of Point Sur, and you can see the boat in the water and the hose. You can see the bubbles and the diver in the water there. And then this is another wonderful photograph. Anybody recognize where this was taken? Lover's Point. So they couldn't dive. at Lover's Point at this time. So before the turn of the 20th century, Monterey County Board of Supervisors made it illegal to dive abalone from north of the Carmel River all the way to the Monterey Wharf. And so this series of photographs I'm showing you actually were taken about 1938 by a photographer named Ray Ruppel. And they took them on a commission for Life magazine. And then the Life magazine had the images, and then World War II broke out, and they never used them. And then we discovered them a few years ago. So you can see Roy going in the water right there. Again, down in the water right there. And then they bring the abalone into the Monterey Wharf, so they would go out for 3-4 days at a time. This is the mother boat that would pull that little dive boat. You can see the box on the bow of that boat, the stern of the boat, I mean. Those are called live boxes. Again, this technology came from Japan, and they would keep the abalone in those live boxes. That's how they kept them fresh. So they pile them up in the boxes, then they would keep the boxes in the water, and while they're out there those 2-3 days at a time, then bring them into the Monterey Wharf. And because of Pop Ernest's recipe that he developed, and because of that World's Fair, they introduced this abalone. By 1920, there were 9 full-time Japanese companies operating off the Monterey Wharf. 9 of them. In 1929, the California alien industry brought almost $1 million in revenue. $1 million. 75% of that came right here in Monterey. And so these boats would go out for 3 days. They'd all come in with 250 dozen fresh red abalone per boat, each coming in every 3 days. They fish usually in the spring and summer for abalone. Here they're unloading it into the box, and then into the cannery, where this is on the Monterey Wharf. There were 2 or 3 different abalone canneries operating off the wharf. There was one big central one that was kind of like a co-op. These are all Japanese ladies at the tables. They're pulling the abalone out of the shell, and then they're going to clean it. That's what these guys are cleaning the whole abalone here. Then those ladies are pulling out of the shell, and then they're going to shuck it and slice it and pound it. Again, that's technology that was created by Pop Ernest Stolter at his restaurant in Monterey in 1907. And then they were boxing it, and it was being shipped all over California at that time. And then here's our friend Pop Ernest Stolter. Perfect. Pop Ernest Stolter at his new restaurant in 1909. There's a photograph of it there. I love this image of it. You can see the wonderful neon sign and the octopus painted on the side of the building right there. And then inside the restaurant here, big abalone shell. And then, as I mentioned, he was famous for his abalone stew, which he would serve in the shell, except the hull of the shell is with lead. This actually is... I mentioned a museum in Tateyama, and I work at that museum. I was a guest curator on an exhibit there a few years ago on abalone as food and beauty, and they created Pop's restaurant in this exhibit, and they actually recreated Japanese style the abalone stew in the restaurant, and the bottle of beer, always at Pop's restaurant right there. And then, of course, there he is, all that abalone shell. So what were they doing all this abalone shell? Well, they couldn't export it out of state, and so they're actually trucking it to Seaside and dumping it in the sand dunes out there in Seaside, and just tons of it out there at one time. And there was a company in Southern California called SLAM, S-A-L-M, and they were sort of in the trinket business. They would come up to Monterey and pick up trainloads of this abalone shell, bring it down to their company in Torrance, their factory, and they're making things like this that they're selling to the tourists all over the United States. This is a piece of Monterey abalone that's cut, and they glue it onto a piece of redwood. Of course, this was a souvenir from Salinas, California. I actually have several of these. I collect them, and I've got some that says souvenir of Ohio, and nothing says Ohio like abalone, right? And then, of course, there's this. This is some of more of those pieces you can see here. There's a heart-shaped little pendant. There's looks like a tree. Always had thermometers in the middle of them. There's the anchor you see over there, again with the thermometer. And then the big red shell is actually from Monterey, and it was polished by a Japanese company, and the box is actually made out of Monterey cypress, also made by the same Japanese company. And in 1908, this piece was presented to Victor Metcalf, who was the then Secretary of the Navy when the Great White Fleet was here. And they presented it to him, and for some reason he didn't take it. It ended up in the Allen Knight collection, and now it's on exhibit at the JCL in Monterey. So, and then again, here is another one of those wonderful pieces, anchor, and I love the box that it's in. And then I have one more, and that's it. Thank you very much. So I know Art TV is coming up next, so I should point out that Art is in the abalone farm business, but Papa Ernest actually had the idea of abalone farm as early as 1925, bought some property in Big Sur, and brought in abalone, worked with some biologists, but they never get the abalone to reproduce. So he wasn't very successful, but he had the idea. All right. Thank you.
Great job. Computer in a second. That's from us. All right. Another hand for Tim Thomas. I told you, encyclopedia of knowledge, man.